So, with the 75th anniversary of the Jeju massacre on the horizon, a recent scandal has actually come to our shores from Seoul, which doesn't usually happen. Now, to explain this recent controversy involving Jeju 4-3, we have lead correspondent for NK News and editorial director at Korea Pro, Jeongmin Kim, with us today to talk about it. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Yeah, we're all followers of you on Twitter. We're big fans.
Thank you. So generous.
I'm a fan of your cat. I'll just put that out there.
He's right there.
Yeah,
right now.
Maybe we can put him on screen. Part of the Twitter fandom.
Yeah.
So before we gush more over you and how much we appreciate your content, you recently wrote an article for NK News about this recent scandal. Could you walk us through exactly what happened?
Well, this happened during the run-up to the big election at the People Power Party, which was actually yesterday. People Power Party was holding two elections. One was for the party leadership and one was for what they call Supreme Council. It's a very high-profile, high-level decision-making body in the party, and it means a lot for the lawmakers. So what the lawmakers usually do is they go to provinces, cities outside Seoul, to meet their supporters and conduct speeches, sometimes catering to the audience of that specific area. And defector lawmaker Tae Yong-ho, he is the lawmaker that represents a very affluent district, Gangnam in Seoul. And he went to Jeju as part of his election activities. And he went there to make a speech. But right before he done that, he went to the memorial altar for the victims of the Jeju massacre, and he kneeled down and apparently he said a few words at the altar that he shared afterwards on his personal Facebook page, and reporters wrote about it. And that enraged a lot of victims' families and a lot of activist groups as well. Because of the content of his remarks, he was saying that as someone who used to work for the Kim Il-sung family regime of North Korea, which he referred to, who were the prime movers in the Jeju April 3 incident, I hereby kneel down to ask for forgiveness to all of the victims who were unjustly sacrificed and their bereaved families. So this is a very loaded sentence. And after he apologized for his former government, the involvement of Communist Party in the history of the massacre, it's already a very, very sensitive issue, especially for the victim's family. And for him to say that without much context in Jeju at the altar, it brought a lot of attention from South Korean media. And afterwards, because he got so much criticism, he tried to explain what he meant by it, and he was using the other election speeches in Jeju and in other places as well to say that he actually learned that in North Korea when he was a student, and that he actually believes that. And he was giving his version of what he knows as history to South Korean supporters, which wasn't received well from both aisles of the party, it seems.
I thought that was really interesting. There's so much to talk about, but just that last part of your introduction, where he talked about that he went to school, and he's like basically saying, I learned this from my textbooks in North Korea where I went to university. So he really put another stamp on it, kind of saying, no, really, this is what I learned. This is what I believe.
Well, and also you cannot really verify that unless you also worked or studied in North Korea. And actually, Chu Sung-ha, another high-profile defector in Seoul, who is currently a reporter at a major news outlet, he actually went on, I think, radio interview and said that although he was also living in Pyongyang, he has never learned that. But it is true that North Koreans use that as a propaganda to show that there were actual loyalists in South Korea during the state-building period for Kim Il-sung, which is true. But he was saying that it's more of a subtle matter, that it's not in textbook, but that maybe some elite people learn about that as part of propaganda.
Yeah.
And afterwards, Tae Yong-ho wrote multiple statements explaining what he meant by it. He said that he's not saying that the government and the state violence is something to forgive. He said that recognizing that, plus how there were communist instruction directly for Kim Il-sung, both that he thinks that both things has to be recognized, and he doubled down on that basically after criticism.
Yeah, I think he even had another press conference, didn't he, on February 15th, maybe? Yeah. No, he was referred to the ethics committee over it, but he also had another press conference, I believe, where he, like you said, doubled down and said, no, the instructions for the uprising on April 3rd came directly from Pyongyang, which is wild accusation. Like, it's wild to think of that because of the implications of it, you know? What was your first response when you heard this, when you were, like, tasked with covering it?
Well, when... that because I know the lawmaker Tae Yong-ho, Congressman Tae Yong-ho, like I have known him for many years, and like looking at him from press point of view, looking at how he conducts election procedures, I don't think from my perspective, it seemed like he actually meant it. It seemed like he actually meant to apologize. He sincerely wanted to somehow apologize. Of course, there's a strategy attached to it because maybe from his point of view, he thought that apologizing will make sense as someone who wants Jeju votes. But then the problem is the history is very, very complicated. Especially if you look at the investigation report from the early 2000s. They do mention the South Korea chapter of the Workers' Party, but because
the manual.
Yes, but because it's such a controversial topic, there's an entire chapter in the investigation dedicated to whether or not there were direct instructions from the headquarters of the South Korea chapter of the Workers' Party Korea or Pyongyang. And investigation concluded that there's no solid evidence that there was direct instruction. But during his multiple statements afterwards, Tae Yong-ho was saying he was, along with how he was taught about Kim Il-sung's involvement on Jeju incident, he said that Kim Il-sung ordered on all people uprising at the time in general, which is true. And the Workers' Party of South Korea's 남조선 노동당 Jeju chapter, following such instruction, also led armed rebellion in Jeju, was his claim. And he says that because he saw so many criticism, he said that all I asked for was forgiveness from the innocent victims that were cruelly murdered. And he was saying, I hope they take my apology as offered with a pure heart and sincerity, and not use it politically. But then when a politician says something, everything is used politically. And I think he knew that. And of course, it's got a lot of accusations of distorting history from the Democratic Party. And also, interestingly, even his own colleagues in the People Power Party.
That was an interesting part of your article when you mentioned how no one wanted to side with him in this particular incident. Do you think that, because we sort of talked about the politics, like I said, we have so much to talk about, but do you think that he is uneducated about Jeju 4-3 in how do I say this, in total?
Well, I think maybe first of all, I think even in South Korea, not everybody has read the entire investigation report. And also, not to mention that in the textbooks, like I've learned in high school, you only see it in one page. So nobody really knows clearly about the details of the history. So it's really easy to just get into like bits of information that are in media and try to match those together. And I think that is what may have happened to him. Maybe he didn't read the entire investigation report or because it was under the progressive government, he maybe thought it was there were inappropriate investigation results in the report. Maybe he thought that. And I think he was insinuating about that. Yeah.
There's a lot of I wouldn't say issues with the investigation result itself, but it is very dense and very complicated with and the fact that we don't have an official title for the Jeju massacre or Jeju Sasam. because we don't fully understand what it is, right?
Exactly.
So I think part of this amorphous place that we are with the history of what it is contributes to people, distorting history. And that's partially because people don't fully know what it is. When in English, I follow a lot of conversations about Sasam online. And I've said this before, that the main way people talk about it has nothing to do with Jeju or the survivor. It has to do with the political implications of it. A lot of people want to use it to bash the United States or to, either pro-North Korea in some ways. But it's never really about the nuanced issues that are involved in it. And I think that's sort of why we still get into this situation where we don't really know what happened. It's being politically pulled in so many different ways. Like years ago, I did a story about how the museum has been sued a dozen times over information that could be incorrect in it, or maybe not incorrect, but not given as much of attention as other aspects of it. And when I interviewed people there, they're like, yeah, there's, like those things did happen, right? So there is this uncertainty about really what happened on Jeju 75 years ago. And I think that's really the crux of...
I think that's a good way to say it. Uncertainty is a really good word.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how we only started investigating it in truth 25 years ago? Well, more than that now, because it's 2023. But after Sudi Samchung came out, then we started the movement in 1978, the movement to start uncovering the truth of what happened. A lot can be lost or misinterpreted, and or because of how complicated it is, it's easy to pick and choose what information you want to prove your points. Now,
and that's
No, continue.
I think that's why it's being it's studied extensively by academics who look at memory politics, right? It's not just about finding documents that can reveal so-called facts about what happened decades ago. It's also about how it's being remembered, how it's being framed, how it's used in contemporary politics. That's why this case of the congressman is very interesting. It was a state building period. There was no North Korea or South Korea. It was at the verge of being created. And from just ordinary people's perspective who lived in Jeju at the time or anywhere else on the Korean peninsula, it's unclear who the enemy is and who the government is, who the power is, who's on my side, who's the enemy. It's very unclear. And from their point of view, just violence is violence. And they want to do something about it. So retrospectively, interpreting that part of the history always has to be, it cannot not be political. That's why politicians have to be careful about it, because it reproduces a certain way of seeing a very uncertain era from contemporary point of view, where now we have North Korea and South Korea. We know what communism is, and we hate it because because we are past that state building period now, and apparently democracy won. But it was a different time at the time. So it's really retrospectively creating a type of memory. So I think that's why politicians from both ends in South Korea were being very, very careful responding to Congressman Tae's comment.
Yeah, that's a good... Well, I interviewed somebody recently, a couple weeks back, who was in Jeongmin. I do a lot of research about Jeongmin, and that's exactly what he said. He said there was a North Korean or a communism rally in Jeongmin at that time, but nobody knew what they were rallying for. It was and I think that is such an interesting point, because a lot of people might ignore the fact that these rallies happened completely because they don't want to connect it to communism. But yet a lot of people who have spoken to me, they say they had no idea what was going on. They had no idea what communism was, not really what democracy was. They were actually too busy just trying to survive the famine and cholera and everything else that was stricken and going on the island at that time. But you mentioned this a little bit.
I want to interrupt you just for the common listener. When you say they didn't know what was going on at the time, are you saying we now, looking back, can't can't say what the rally was for, or that the people around were not aware what the rally was for. Can you clarify that?
Well, we know what communism is now, right? And and what it means in a Korean context, in a Korean peninsula concept. Back then, they didn't, right? North Korea, the communism in itself didn't have this negative connotations it has now in a democratic lens, right? Mm-hmm. So and having a rally at, and not really sure what it is, it's a political rally, I would probably go out and see what it is.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
Maybe some people truly understood what communism was that was like spearheading this thing, but not everybody. Most of them probably didn't.
That makes sense. And then that goes into, Jeongmin, one of the things I was curious about having read your article is, what exactly do you think that the Jeju people were so upset about? Being linked? What is it that the feeling was that there was this just outcry against him?
That's actually what I wanted to ask you. Being on the ground in Jeju, I was actually curious, but there were a few Victims Family Association that came to Seoul to protest against that. And I reviewed what they were saying. It seems like they were actually referring back to the investigation report. They were saying that it was already concluded that there was no direct instruction to the rally from the headquarters of the Workers' Party Korea, and now you're revising that, a revisionist view of the history, basically. I think that part was officially what they were mad about, distorting history. But then if you think about it from family's point of view, if anyone lived in Jeju at the time, they would have been impacted. And to say that it was instructed directly by Kim Il-sung, even if you call them victims, it creates a weird dynamics where you start thinking, so people said yes to a communist rally, and that makes it difficult for the families to explain to others what happened and why. So I think they were upset partly because of that. And another part was how it was used politically from Congressman Tae, because he was visiting the island for the votes. He was going there for the election. And to choose that as his talking point, I think that was also upsetting just for Jeju people in general as well. And Democratic Party, of course, they also used wrote a statement that was, they wrote a statement saying that Congressman Tae, you have to stop using the propaganda tactics that you learned in Korea.
Yep.
They said that, so they went for that angle.
Really did. They dropped that word real quick.
So let's think about this for a second. If it had been actually sent from North Korea as a message to conduct that attack, what would that mean?
If there was a direct instruction.
Yeah, if Kim Il-sung ordered that attack on April 3rd, 1948 to attack the polling stations and the government officials and all that kind of stuff.
From my point of view, it really doesn't change anything that much from when you look at it from the perspective of how Kim Il-sung wanted a separate Korea in the northern part of the peninsula. It doesn't change anything about that. Right. It always had that motivation. And that's why people talk about how there was an upcoming election in South Korea, and they'd like to link to that. But it does change things from how it's being remembered, because it makes it into a very black and white sort of picture. From people's point of view, they had many things to rally about, not just because some supreme leader gave them instruction.
This is my possible thought of what that might change, and feel free to disagree. But if North Korea if Kim Il-sung did give that order, and they did respond with such a strong reaction that resulted in the deaths of 30,000, the South Korean government responded with that reaction that resulted in the deaths of 30,000 people, wouldn't that piece of knowledge potentially somewhat, not justifies the wrong word, but it would take a little bit away of the guilt away potentially from the government for the deaths of the people, because it was literally the beginning. It would literally be the beginning of the Korean War, which some scholars
taking it out of their hands.
Right. I think first part of I guess the first few days of the intervention might be justified, but from my point of view, it doesn't change anything about how there was state violence against people afterwards, after that few days, that they wanted to get rid of potential spies or potential Communist Party vanguards. It doesn't change the fact that they continued that for years.
Right. But what I mean, I'm not trying to say that, like, I'm saying that it could be used to lessen the responsibility of the violence. I'm not saying that's what I'm saying as a propaganda
That's
purpose.
how that is being used by many right-wing YouTubers, right-wing commentators. That's how they frame it, because of course, usually that type of group is linked to how they think that Lee Seung-man is such a perfect leader during that period. So it could be used like that they were trying to protect the country.
And another reason that it may be so controversial here is the fact that the island has worked so hard to distance themselves from being called commies and from being called a red island. I think
it's still ongoing.
Yeah.
Well, the recent bullying scandal, right? With Yoon's former colleague, he recently resigned from what is the position that he had? I can't think of it off the top of my head. Where is it? I have it on my notes.
I think
Chung Sun-shin. He was alongside President Yoon Suk-yeol in the Public Prosecution's Office. He resigned recently after being appointed to the head the police's National Office investigation over his son bullying a Jeju student in high school at a prestigious dormitory, and he was calling him a commie. And he was calling him a Jeju pig, but also a commie, which is kind of like connected to this issue, because Jeju people have been, called that, and that term has been used until like 2000 to belittle and to prevent Jeju people from really actually participating in society. I've known people who had to move to the mainland to escape their association with Jeju, and they had to pretend that they weren't from here just in order to get jobs, and they were still hounded by police who found out who they, just because
their criminal history.
Exactly. So I think that is one of the reasons why the local people would be upset about again being connected to for this issue to again be connected to communism and to North Korea.
Right. It has been a long struggle, and I think it was interesting how the families were citing what the president himself promised to the Jeju people a year ago. He said that he will work his best to make sure that the Jeju people are not defamed or by distorted history. And that's why he visited Jeju at the time. And I think that's why, because they know how much struggle that the Jeju residents have gone through in the past decades. And from political calculation, People Power Party knows this. And because they need the votes, I think that's why even the conservative, the most conservative lawmakers in that party, like Chung Jin-seok, they were drawing a line between Congressman Tae and them, saying that this is not a party line. You have to be more careful. We will do our best following Yoon's instruction to make sure that people are not defamed.
Right. And so then to kind of wrap that, to go back to what you first said about the election was today? Yesterday. So what was the result of that?
He won.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Because it was him, my first reaction when I heard this was I wanted to know if he had extra information we didn't.
I was also curious because it didn't seem like he crafted a lie. It seemed like he actually believed and wanted to apologize. And that's what struck me as very interesting. And I would love to know more what he has been taught in North Korea. If that's the case, I would love to interview him.
Right.
To figure out what kind of pieces of information that led to the conclusion. He was citing some parts of history that he learned in North Korea and knows from what he learned in South Korea, as well as citing some of the close Kim Il-sung aides at the time and how some of them defected back to North Korea and they were considered loyal, considered martyrs. They were heroified in North Korea. But then so far, I couldn't see like hard evidence to support his main claim.
Yeah, he said 4 people, I believe. 4 people defected, went back on North Korean boats or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm only familiar with one person who went back, and that's Kim Dal-sam, who was the leader of the uprising on that day, and he died on fighting for North Korea during the Korean War. But like, I don't know how he got back there, and all of a sudden there's 3 other people that potentially went back on some sort of North Korean boat.
Yeah.
From where? Where did there's just a lot of questions that I would like to ask him about that.
He'd be fun to have on the podcast. I also thought part of your article was really interesting because you did bring up that even in South Korea, in the textbooks in South Korea, it was only amended, and I can't quote the year because my memory is horrible, but South Korea textbooks were only amended not so long ago. So it does seem plausible that what was being taught in North Korea, maybe it's not so far-fetched.
Right. I'm scared to ask my dad about it because probably the older generations in South Korea were also taught that it was a communist uprising. It was noted as communist-linked uprising for decades, and then after democratization, they dropped it, but it was still mentioned as uprising. But it was only amended just a few years ago when the textbooks were decentralized, but there are currently movements to change some parts of the textbooks back. So that's a space to keep an eye on as well, because there's a lot of other histories in South Korea and modern contemporary era that's going to be involved in that kind of changes.
That recently was up for debate too, about the inclusion of Sasam in the history textbooks. And I believe Yoon's administration decided to keep it as is for now. But, I mean, it could still change. So what do you think this says about the current state of 4-3, the fact that this scandal happened?
I think it shows how little Koreans know about it.
Yes.
I also feel guilty about it because I only learned about Jeju Sasam in college because my professors were really into memory politics, and some of them are academics that study the Jeju Sasam. And because I was in Asian studies, I got to luckily learn about that. And not just that, but also Nogunri incidents and other red baiting massacres, small and big massacres during the state building period on the Korean peninsula. And I personally have experience hearing about this from my grandma, who was also almost became the victim of red baiting at the time because it was really unclear who's who. So it's a real part of the history for everybody, but then we don't get to learn the details. And I could see from the replies to the incident of Congressman Tae's remark that everybody has different ideas about what this is. Some people don't even really know about this. And also matched with lack of knowledge and sensitivity, political sensitivity.
Yes.
It's a great recipe for disaster. It's very prone to being used one way or another every time there's a political event. And every time that happens, residents of Jeju will face the struggle. So I think way forward would be to be able to teach the full detail of the investigation as much as possible for the younger generations before it gets distorted and then handed down to history.
Yeah. On one hand, I guess that's a good reason for the Jeju Families Association to constantly be on guard and ready to come back up against something like this. They hear it, they make a stand, they go and protest. So on one hand, they really need to be diligent.
I believe that's the main function of those associations. Talking to Young Ki-young, the author of Suri Samcheon recently, he was saying, I asked him about that same question I asked you, what do you think of the state of Sasam? And he said it's going to go up and down. It's going to be tugged back and forth based on the political control of the, of the country. But as long as those associations are there to stand guard, the truth will be kept, will be saved, right? So, do you
also just final thoughts from me? I think it's also for education purposes. I think it's important that an administration, especially not just particularly Yoon administration, but any South Korean administration, I think it's important to teach the younger generations that history during the state building period, or just right now, contemporary, it's not black and white. There are a lot of uncertainties going on. It's not just about learning bullet points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that happened this year. There's a lot of different dynamics that work in a different way at certain era. So if you look back at incidents like Jeju or Nogunri too, from today's perspective, it's very easy to distort and remember the distorted versions. So I think it's important for the history education to remain subtle and nuanced as much as possible. And I think administration should really work hard to do that, I think.
Seems a long time coming, Yeah. So,
that's why I think these next couple of years are actually really important to speak to as many survivors as possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because we don't have that much time left, right? But so thank you very much for being on our show. If you ever do get to interview Tae, we have to have you come back on again to tell us how that goes.
Gosh. That would be interesting. Yeah.
And in the meanwhile, I'm planning to baseline some of the North Korean state media. That's what I do, North Korean state media, to figure out if they actually did mention Jeju Sasam and those people that Congressman Tae mentioned. If how are they using it these days to frame the history? I think that will also be important to cross-check some of the things that are being said.
Yeah, you have a really interesting job, and I do want to encourage our listeners to check out your Twitter because it's really fascinating. Just not only can we see pictures of your cats, but we, just going through your Twitter wall, and just seeing all the little things. Like I really enjoyed is I find it very interesting your knowledge, with the daughter right now. That was a lot of interesting articles and a lot of interesting comments, and your comments about the daughter coming into play with this recent ceremony. And anyways, I encourage all our listeners to go check out your Twitter.
Thank you.
It's really interesting.
We'll have a link to it in the show notes for everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. That's so generous of you.
It's the least we could do.
But thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.